The General's Dilemma. The air in General George C. Marshall's office in the munitions building in Washington, D.C., was thick with the scent of map paper, stale cigar smoke, and impending conflict. It was mid-1941, and while America clung precariously to neutrality, Marshall, the Army's stoic and brilliant chief of staff, lived in a world of grim certainties. The war in Europe was a raging inferno, and the ambitions of Imperial Japan cast a long shadow across the Pacific. Marshall's job was not to hope for peace, but to prepare for a war of unimaginable scale. Pinned to the walls around him were maps of the world, soon to be crisscrossed with the arrows of invasion forces and the red lines of supply routes. His desk was buried under projections, logistical tables, and mobilization plans. And they all told the same terrifying story. Declassified planning documents from the War Department, under the heading Ultimate Strength Requirements, Two-Front War Scenario, reveal the staggering numbers. The Army estimated it would need a force of over 8 million men, a figure that would strain the nation's manpower to its absolute limit. The core of Marshall's strategic problem lay in a simple, brutal equation. For every soldier on the front line, several more were needed in non-combat support roles to keep him armed, fed, and informed. These were the typists, the telephone operators, the clerks, the drivers, the mechanics, the supply sergeants, the essential cogs in the vast military machine. And in 1941, virtually every one of these positions was filled by a man. Marshall saw these soldiers, typing reports in triplicate or directing telephone traffic at a stateside base, and envisioned them carrying a rifle in North Africa or the Philippines. This internal drain on combat strength was, in his analytical mind, an unacceptable strategic vulnerability. He needed to find a way to release a man to fight, a phrase that would soon become a national mantra. The British had already faced this reality and had formed the Auxiliary Territorial Service, ATS, integrating women into their military support structure with remarkable success. Marshall, an avid student of military history and contemporary strategy, saw the British model not as a social experiment, but as a pragmatic solution to a lethal mathematical problem. He confided in his staff, his frustration clear in internal memos, that tradition and prejudice were hampering the Army's ability to prepare for the inevitable. He needed a new source of intelligent, disciplined personnel for those vital rear echelon jobs. The answer was staring him in the face, present in the nation's offices, schools, and homes, but tapping into it would require a political and cultural battle as challenging as any he would plan on the battlefield. He needed an army of women. The question was, how could he convince a deeply traditionalist Congress and an even more skeptical American public? Hello, listener, let me know where you're watching from. And if you don't mind subscribing to the channel and giving it a like, I'd be very pleased as the author. Enjoy listening. A Congresswoman's Crusade. The initial volley in this battle was not fired by General Marshall, but by a tenacious Republican Congresswoman from Massachusetts, Edith Nourse Rogers. A formidable and respected figure on Capitol Hill, Rogers had seen the devastating aftermath of war firsthand. She had served as a volunteer with the Red Cross in France during World War I, witnessing the dedication of female volunteers who worked in horrific conditions without any official status, benefits, or protection. When these women returned home, sometimes grievously ill or wounded, they received no pension, no veterans' health care, no flag for their coffin. The injustice of it burned in her for 2 decades. Archival records from the Library of Congress show that on May 28, 1941, months before Pearl Harbor, Congresswoman Rogers introduced H.R. 4906, a bill to establish a Women's Army Auxiliary Corps for service with the Army of the United States. Her timing was impeccable, aligning perfectly with Marshall's private concerns. The bill was the culmination of years of advocacy, a direct attempt to rectify the wrongs she had witnessed. Rogers envisioned a corps of women serving with the Army, not just as volunteers, but as a uniformed, disciplined body. Her initial proposal was carefully worded. The term auxiliary was a crucial concession, signaling that these women would not be soldiers in the traditional sense, but a separate, parallel organization. This seemingly minor semantic point was, in reality, a brilliant political tactic designed to disarm the inevitable opposition. But even with this compromise, the bill was met with a storm of derision and outright hostility. The floor of Congress, as captured in the dry, official language of the congressional record, became a theater for the anxieties of a nation grappling with the potential upheaval of traditional gender roles. Opponents painted lurid pictures of the moral chaos that would ensue. One congressman from Missouri thundered, "Who will then do the cooking, the washing, the mending, who will nurture the children?" Another infamously asked, "Take the women into the armed service, who will then do the crying?" The hearings were brutal. The bill was lampooned in the press, with editorial cartoons depicting women in uniform as comical, mannish figures or, more insidiously, as a threat to the American family. Rogers, however, was unyielding. Supported by Marshall, who provided the War Department's official, if quiet, endorsement, she argued her case with logic and passion. She spoke not of radical social change, but of patriotic necessity. She presented the hard data on the looming manpower shortage and held up the British example. She was not asking for a favor for women, she was offering a solution to a national crisis. The bill languished in committee for months, a political hot potato that few wanted to touch. It was a bold idea, perhaps too bold for a nation still clinging to the illusion of peace. It would take a catastrophic national trauma to transform Rogers's crusade from a fringe political issue into an urgent matter of national survival. The search for a leader. While Edith Norris Rogers fought the public battle in the halls of Congress, General Marshall was engaged in a quieter, more deliberate campaign within the War Department. He knew that if the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, WAAC, was to have any chance of success, it needed a director of unimpeachable character and extraordinary ability. This was not a role for a society doyen or a radical firebrand. The opposition was already painting the future Corps as a haven for the morally suspect or the aggressively unfeminine. Marshall needed a leader who could project an image of supreme competence, traditional grace, and unwavering patriotism. His choice would have to be a master administrator, a skilled politician, and a public relations genius, capable of building a complex organization from the ground up while simultaneously winning over a hostile public. The search, conducted with quiet urgency throughout the latter half of 1941, was extensive. A short list of prominent American women was compiled, including college presidents and business executives. But Marshall's gaze eventually settled on a surprising candidate, a woman who was not a nationally known figure but possessed the precise, formidable skills said he required, Oveta Culp Hobby. At 36, Hobby was a force of nature in Texas. Her biography reads like a blueprint for a leader. By the age of 20, she was the parliamentarian for the Texas House of Representatives. She had authored a respected textbook on parliamentary procedure. She had married a former governor of Texas, William P. Hobby, and was now the executive vice president of his newspaper, the Houston Post. She was a mother, a legal scholar, and a sharp, disciplined executive who knew how to manage a large, complex organization. Crucially, she understood the mechanics of government and the art of public persuasion. In the summer of 1941, Marshall summoned her to Washington, ostensibly to head the newly formed Women's Interest Section of the War Department's Bureau of Public Relations. This was, in effect, her audition. Her task was to answer the flood of letters from women wanting to know how they could serve the country. Her performance was masterful. Her personal correspondence from this period reveals a mind that was both analytical and empathetic. She responded to the public's anxieties with calm, reasoned logic, and she articulated the Army's growing need for female service with clarity and force. Marshall was deeply impressed. Here was a woman who spoke with quiet authority, who was impeccably dressed and poised, yet possessed a steel-trap mind and an iron will. She was the perfect Trojan horse to breach the walls of public and military prejudice. He saw in her not just an administrator, but a symbol. If a woman like Oveta Culp Hobby, a respected professional, wife, and mother, was willing to lead this new corps, it would lend the entire endeavor a powerful, unassailable legitimacy. The decision was made. If Congress passed the bill, Oveta Culp Hobby would be its first director. The crucible of Congress. With Marshall's candidate identified and Rogers's bill stalled, the political stalemate dragged on into the autumn of 1941. The War Department, now actively backing the legislation, prepared for a full-scale assault on congressional skepticism. The Bureau of the Budget was ordered to conduct a study, and its report, submitted in October, was a ringing endorsement. It concluded that the use of women in non-combatant roles was not only feasible but essential and would result in a far more efficient use of our manpower. Armed with this official validation, Marshall and Rogers renewed their offensive. The congressional hearings that followed were a crucible, a raw display of the cultural anxieties gripping the nation. Transcripts of the proceedings are a startling record of the era's entrenched sexism. Opponents, a coalition of conservative Southern Democrats and isolationist Republicans, argued that military service would unsex American women. They raised the specter of women abandoning their families, of rampant immorality on military bases, and of the Army being forced to spend millions on cosmetic kits and beauty parlors. The slander was often personal and vicious, aimed directly at Congresswoman Rogers. Yet, for every opponent, there was a powerful voice of support. Major General Emory S. Adams of the Adjutant General's office testified bluntly, "Every man we can replace with a woman is one more man for the combat services. The need is great." Hobby, in her role at the War Department, worked tirelessly behind the scenes, providing Rogers with data, talking points, and strategic advice. She understood that the key to victory was to frame the debate not around women's rights, but around military necessity. The arguments had to be pragmatic, unemotional, and relentlessly focused on the single goal of winning the coming war. She coached military officials on how to testify, urging them to stick to the facts of the manpower shortage. The turning point in the debate can be traced to General Marshall's own powerful, albeit indirect, influence. He made it clear to key committee members that the WAAC was not a frivolous social project but a core component of his strategic mobilization plan. His immense prestige, he was perhaps the most respected man in Washington, lent the bill a gravity that its opponents could not easily dismiss. Slowly, painstakingly, the tide began to turn. A vote was scheduled for early December 1941. It was expected to be close, the bill's fate hanging by a thread. The arguments had been made, the political capital spent. The nation, and its military, stood at a crossroads, debating the very definition of service and sacrifice. And then, the debate was rendered instantly, violently, obsolete. A mandate written in smoke and fire. On the morning of Sunday, December 7, 1941, the abstract arguments in Washington, D.C. were consumed by the smoke and fire of Pearl Harbor. The theoretical manpower crisis became a terrifying, immediate reality. The attack shattered America's isolationism and plunged the nation into the global conflict Marshall had long foreseen. In an instant, the debate over the WAAC was transformed. What had been a controversial proposal a day earlier now seemed like a prescient, even essential, measure. The need to release a man to fight was no longer a catchy slogan, it was a sacred national duty. The political opposition to the WAAC bill evaporated overnight. To vote against it now was to vote against providing the Army with every possible tool for victory. It was tantamount to being unpatriotic. The bill, which had been languishing for over 6 months, was rocketed to the top of the legislative agenda. When Congress reconvened, the atmosphere was entirely different. The previous derision and condescension were replaced by a grim sense of purpose. On May 14, 1942, the House of Representatives passed the bill 249-86. The following day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the WAAC bill into law. Oveta Culp Hobby stood near him during the signing ceremony at the White House, her expression a mixture of solemnity and resolve. It was a momentous victory, but a compromised one. The final legislation still established the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. The women would serve with the Army, but not in it. This meant they would not have the same rank, pay, or benefits as male soldiers. They would be, in a legal and practical sense, a civilian organization in military uniforms. This auxiliary status was a lingering remnant of the pre-war political battles, a concession made to secure the bill's passage. Hobby knew, with the clear-sightedness of a master strategist, that this would create immense logistical and morale problems down the line. But for now, it was the law. The battle in Congress was won. A far greater challenge now lay before her. She had a law, a title, director of the WAAC, and an office. She had no staff, no budget, no uniforms, no barracks, no training manuals, and no recruits. She had only a mandate from her president and the backing of the Army's most powerful general. From this, she was expected to build an army of 150,000 women while a world war raged around her. The task was immense, unprecedented, and, to many, utterly impossible. The architect in the munitions building. On May 16, 1942, the day after President Roosevelt signed the WAAC bill into law, Oveta Culp Hobby was sworn in as its first director. There was no grand ceremony, just a simple oath administered in the cavernous, labyrinthine munitions building on Constitution Avenue. She was awarded the rank of colonel, a decision made by Marshall himself to give her the necessary authority to deal with the Army's deeply hierarchical, male-dominated bureaucracy. But this rank was a hollow shell. Her office was a small, borrowed space, starkly furnished with a desk, 2 chairs, and a telephone that didn't yet work. Her initial staff consisted of a single secretary. Before her lay a task of creation so vast it bordered on the absurd. She had to conjure, out of thin air, the entire structure of a military corps, its regulations, its housing, its supply chains, its medical care, its training curriculum, its recruitment strategy, and its public image. Her personal day planners from this period, now preserved in the National Archives, are a testament to a mind that did not sleep. The pages are a dense web of tasks, from finalize uniform specifications and secure training facility to draft disciplinary code and establish pay scale equivalency. She was building a corporation, an educational institution, and a military unit all at once, and all from scratch. Her first and most crucial decision was to surround herself with the right people. Knowing she could not navigate the treacherous waters of Army bureaucracy alone, she relied on the sharp, experienced military minds Marshall assigned to her, chief among them Colonel Don C. Faith, a seasoned West Point graduate. He became her indispensable liaison, translating her civilian executive directives into the arcane language of Army orders and requisitions. But the soul of the Corps had to come from women. Hobby began headhunting a small cadre of brilliant female administrators, educators, and professionals to be her Corps Advisory Council. They became her brain trust, working 18-hour days in that cramped office, fueled by coffee and a burning sense of historic purpose. They were designing not just a Corps, but a new paradigm for women in public service, and every decision was fraught with significance. For example, the very regulations governing the lives of the WWII had to be written from a blank page. Army regulations were written for men, covering everything from barracks fights to paternity leave. Hobby's team had to meticulously craft a new code of conduct that addressed the unique realities of a female corps while maintaining unwavering military discipline. It was an intellectual and administrative marathon, run at a sprinter's pace, all under the skeptical gaze of the War Department. Designing the WAAC. Director Hobby understood a fundamental truth that many in the War Department did not. The first battle the WAAC would fight was not in a supply depot or a communications hub, but in the court of public opinion. The Corps had to project an image of impeccable professionalism, discipline, and femininity to counteract the vicious propaganda of its detractors. The most powerful weapon in this public relations war would be the uniform. The design of the WAAC uniform became an exercise in strategic branding. Declassified memos between Hobby's office and the Quartermaster Corps reveal a meticulous, often contentious, design process. Hobby rejected early, frumpy designs, insisting on a uniform that was smart, tailored, and dignified. She wanted something that would instill pride in the wearer and command respect from the observer. The final ensemble was a masterpiece of compromise, a summer uniform of khaki cotton twill and a winter version in olive drab wool, both featuring a belted jacket, a six-gored skirt, and a matching cap. This cap, a stylish but sturdy model that would become known as the Hobby hat, was her personal touch. While slacks and coveralls were later authorized for women performing mechanical or physical labor, the skirt was the public face of the WAAC. A constant visual reassurance to a nervous public that these women were still ladies. Every detail was considered. The corps insignia, which would be worn on the lapels, was of immense symbolic importance. Hobby personally selected the design, the head of Pallas Athene, the Greek goddess of wisdom, strategic warfare, and handicrafts. It was a perfect choice, embodying the intelligence, skill, and purpose of the new corps. Even the question of makeup was addressed with tactical precision. To combat fears that the Army would defeminize women, Hobby consulted with beauty experts, including Elizabeth Arden. The result was the official issuance of lipstick and makeup in carefully selected, appropriately subtle shades, such as the iconic Montezuma red lipstick for dress uniforms. This was not about vanity, it was a calculated policy to maintain morale and present a polished, professional image that defied the crude caricatures of mannish soldiers. The uniform, the insignia, the grooming standards, these were not superficial details. They were the carefully crafted armor the first WWII would wear as they stepped onto the national stage, designed to deflect prejudice and embody the Corps' motto, "It's a woman's war, too." The deluge of applicants and the first officer candidates. With the legal framework in place and the uniform designed, Hobby's next monumental task was to find the women who would fill them. The law authorized a corps of 150,000, but it all had to start with the first, critical group, the officer candidates who would form the leadership cadre. The plan was to recruit and train an initial class of 440 officer candidates and 400 enlisted auxiliaries. On May 27, 1942, the Army launched a nationwide recruitment campaign. The response was a shock, even to the WWII's most optimistic supporters. And a stunning rebuke to the congressional naysayers who claimed no decent woman would join. Over 35,000 women flooded the recruiting stations to apply for the first 440 officer candidate slots. This deluge of applications was a profound validation of Hobby's and Marshall's vision. The applicants were not the marginalized or desperate figures critics had imagined. A deep analysis of these early application files reveals a cross-section of the nation's best and brightest. They were college graduates, teachers, lawyers, business executives, journalists, and scientists. Their ages ranged from 21 to 50, and their motivations, captured in handwritten essays, were a moving tapestry of patriotism and personal ambition. Some were driven by the loss of a brother, husband, or sweetheart in the war. Others felt stifled by the limited opportunities available to women and saw the WWII as a chance for adventure and meaningful work. A common theme, echoed in countless files, was a deep-seated frustration with sitting on the sidelines while their country was in peril. Hobby insisted on a selection process of unprecedented rigor. She knew that this first class would be scrutinized like no other group in American military history. They had to be academically superior, physically fit, and of unimpeachable character. Each applicant underwent a series of interviews, intelligence tests, the Army General Classification Test, and background checks. Hobby's explicit instructions to the selection boards were to find natural leaders with poise, sound judgment, and a high sense of duty. She was not just filling slots, she was handpicking the foundation of her entire corps. The quality of the women chosen was astonishing. One successful candidate was a dean of women from a California university, another was a lawyer from a prestigious New York firm. They were accomplished, mature, and deeply committed. The selection of this first class, known as the 440, was Hobby's first tangible victory. It proved that American women were not only willing but desperately eager to serve, and that the WWII could be a corps of leaders, not just laborers. Hobby's folly, building a training center. Now that she had her officer candidates, Director Hobby needed a place to forge them into a cohesive military unit. The search for a training center was fraught with logistical and political challenges. The Army was undergoing the largest expansion in its history, and every available base was already overflowing with male recruits. After a frantic nationwide survey, the War Department settled on Fort Des Moines, Iowa. On paper, it was a logical choice. It was centrally located and, as a recently decommissioned cavalry post, it was available. In reality, it was a logistical nightmare. Fort Des Moines was a relic of another era. Built in 1901, it was designed for men and horses, not for the first female army in American history. When the first Army planners arrived in early June 1942, they were met with the lingering scent of hay and manure from the vast brick stables and a facility in a state of profound disrepair. The barracks were Spartan blocks designed for male soldiers. The plumbing was inadequate and entirely wrong. The kitchens were set up to cook massive, unrefined meals for men. Everything had to be converted, and time was running out. The first class of officer candidates was scheduled to arrive on July 20th, less than 2 months away. A frantic period of construction and conversion began. Archival requisitions from the Quartermaster Corps detail the mad scramble, urgent orders for thousands of new beds, mattresses, and footlockers appropriately sized for women, contracts for carpenters to partition huge, open squad bays into smaller, more private cubicles, and frantic calls to plumbing suppliers for the fixtures needed to convert the latrines. The massive stables, icons of the fort's cavalry past, were gutted and hastily converted into classrooms and administrative offices. The old riding hall became a cavernous drill floor. To many of the grizzled, old-school Army officers assigned to oversee the work, the project seemed like a bizarre and wasteful diversion. Whispers of Hobby's folly and the Powder Puff Palace were common. Hobby herself made several trips to Iowa, her presence a galvanizing force. Dressed in her impeccable civilian suits, she would walk the muddy construction sites, conferring with engineers and haranguing contractors. Her sharp questions and encyclopedic grasp of the project's details left no doubt that she was in command. She was not just a distant director in Washington, she was the architect on the ground, ensuring that her corps would have a proper home. As trucks delivered supplies and hammers echoed day and night, the old cavalry post was slowly, painfully transformed. It was a race against the clock, a physical manifestation of the larger struggle to create something entirely new within the rigid confines of the old Army. The curriculum of a new soldier. On July 20, 1942, just as scheduled, the 440 officer candidates and 400 enlisted women of the first WAAC class arrived at a still chaotic Fort Des Moines. They stepped off the trains into a world of mud, sawhorses, and hammering, their smart civilian clothes starkly out of place. The curriculum that awaited them was a revolutionary experiment in military education, designed by Hobby and her team to achieve a complex psychological and practical transformation. The 6-week officer training course was a grueling hybrid of military indoctrination and specialized administrative instruction. The first objective was to strip away civilian identity and instill military discipline. This involved what male recruits called basic training, endless hours of close-order drill on the parade ground under the hot Iowa sun, classes on military courtesy and tradition, and the meticulous maintenance of uniforms and living quarters. They learned to salute, to say yes, sir, and to subordinate their individuality to the needs of the unit. This process, overseen by regular Army officers, some of whom were deeply skeptical, was designed to forge a disparate group of individuals into a cohesive team with an unshakable esprit de corps. The second, equally critical part of the curriculum focused on the specific jobs they would perform. Unlike male officer candidate schools, which focused on combat leadership, the WWII was a school for military managers. The curriculum, detailed in newly printed Army field manuals with WAAC stamped on the cover, included courses in Army organization, supply management, company administration, paperwork, and motor transport supervision. They were being trained not to lead men into battle, but to command the women who would take over the administrative and logistical jobs that kept the Army functioning. There was no weapons training, the law strictly forbade it. This was a constant reminder of their auxiliary, non-combatant status. The psychological toll was immense. The women, many of whom came from professional leadership positions, had to adjust to a life of regimentation and unquestioning obedience. Yet, an analysis of their diaries and letters home reveals a profound sense of purpose that transcended the daily hardships. They understood they were pioneers, and that the future of the entire Corps rested on their shoulders. On August 29, 1942, after 6 exhausting weeks, the first WAAC officer candidate class graduated. In a formal ceremony on the fort's main parade ground, Director Oveta Culp Hobby, now in her own tailored WAAC uniform, watched as the 436 women who completed the course, 4 had dropped out, pinned on the gold bars of a third officer, the WAAC equivalent of a second lieutenant. They were no longer civilians. They were the leaders of a new army, ready to be sent across the country to train the tens of thousands who would follow. The experiment was no longer a theory, it was a living, breathing reality. The real test was about to begin. The quiet invasion of the army posts. With the first officer class graduated, a steady stream of newly minted third officers fanned out across the United States. Their mission was twofold: to establish WAAC detachments at existing army posts and to command the thousands of new enlisted auxiliaries now pouring into Fort Des Moines for their own basic training. This was, in effect, a quiet invasion. Each detachment's arrival at an Army air base, supply depot, or headquarters was a moment of profound cultural collision. The commanding officers of these posts, almost universally men who had spent their entire careers in a masculine military environment, had often requisitioned WWII out of desperation for manpower, but viewed their imminent arrival with a mixture of dread and curiosity. Declassified post-action reports from commanders at places like Daytona Beach, Florida, home to the first WAAC unit assigned to the Army Air Forces, and Fort Riley, Kansas, reveal a consistent pattern. The initial reception was frosty, marked by awkwardness and suspicion. Male soldiers, unaccustomed to seeing women in uniform, often resorted to catcalls, whistles, or a resentful silence. The WWII were assigned the most mundane jobs: typing, filing, answering phones, the very housekeeping tasks the Army was desperate to offload, but which initially did little to showcase the women's full capabilities. This was the first critical test of the Corps' discipline. Trained by Hobby to anticipate this resistance, the WWII responded not with anger, but with overwhelming competence. They arrived for duty early. Their uniforms were immaculate. Their work was fast and error-free. The switchboards they took over, once a bottleneck of inefficiency, began to operate with crisp precision. The administrative backlogs in personnel offices, which had buried male clerks in paper, began to shrink. The change was slow, but undeniable. A once skeptical base commander at an air transport command base in Texas wrote in a now declassified memo to his superiors in early 1943, "Initial reservations regarding the employment of WAAC personnel have proven entirely unfounded. Detachment C performs its duties with an efficiency and attention to detail that is, frankly, superior to that of the soldiers they replaced. My request for a second company is attached." This was the victory Hobby had planned for, a conquest not by force, but by excellence. The WWII were proving their value: one flawlessly typed report, one efficiently routed truck, and one perfectly connected phone call at a time. They were demonstrating that Pallas Athene was not just an insignia on their lapel, it was their operational doctrine. The war at home, the slander campaign. Just as the WAAC was beginning to win over the military establishment through sheer competence, a new and far more insidious enemy attacked. Beginning in the spring of 1943, a vicious and coordinated slander campaign erupted across the United States. It was a storm of rumors, jokes, and malicious gossip aimed at destroying the reputation of the Corps and discouraging recruitment. This was not random chatter. FBI records, declassified decades later, confirmed that President Roosevelt himself believed it to be a deliberate propaganda effort, possibly instigated by Axis agents, to undermine a successful home front mobilization program. The attack was waged in whispers, in anonymous letters to the parents of WWII, and in salacious jokes told by radio comedians. The core of the slander was sexual in nature, designed to play on the public's deepest anxieties about women leaving the home. The most pervasive and damaging rumors alleged rampant promiscuity and immorality within the Corps. Vicious lies circulated that WWII were issued contraceptives as standard equipment, that 90% of them were pregnant or had been prostitutes in civilian life, and that their primary purpose was to serve as morale boosters for male soldiers. Editorial cartoons, which had once been merely condescending, turned vile, depicting WWII as sloppy, drunken, and morally loose. The campaign was devastatingly effective because it targeted the women's families and communities. Parents who had proudly sent their daughters off to serve were now bombarded with anonymous letters filled with lurid falsehoods. The impact on morale within the Corps was immediate and severe. Women who had joined out of pure patriotism were now viewed with suspicion and contempt by the very public they had sworn to serve. Recruitment numbers, which had been robust, plummeted. A deep analysis of the campaign reveals its strategic genius. It bypassed the military command structure and attacked the WWII civilian support system. It sought to shame them into quitting and frighten potential recruits away. For Director Hobby, this was a crisis graver than any logistical challenge. The very honor of her corps was under attack. She knew that if she could not defeat this enemy within, the WAAC would not survive. The war for the WAAC was no longer just about proving their utility, it was now a desperate fight for their very dignity. Hobby's counteroffensive. Faced with the firestorm of slander, Oveta Culp Hobby demonstrated the full measure of her leadership. She could not order the rumors to cease or court-martial the civilians spreading them. She had to fight a public relations war, and she marshaled her forces with the precision of a field general. Her strategy was multi-pronged and brilliant in its execution. First, she went on the offensive in the press. Armed with an ironclad sense of conviction, she met with the nation's most powerful newspaper publishers and magazine editors. In these off-the-record meetings, detailed in her private papers, she did not plead for sympathy, she presented facts. She laid out the rigorous selection standards for the WWII, the quality of the women in the Corps, and the absurdity of the rumors. She challenged them directly. You are men of influence. You can either be a party to this baseless slander against the daughters and sisters of this nation, or you can print the truth. Many, swayed by her integrity and logic, agreed to help. Feature articles began appearing in publications like Life and the Saturday Evening Post, profiling the hard work and patriotism of the WWII and debunking the myths. Second, Hobby enlisted the most powerful voices in the country. She secured the unequivocal public support of General Marshall, General Eisenhower, and, most importantly, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who wrote extensively in her My Day column in praise of the Corps. President Roosevelt, furious at the campaign, took the extraordinary step of holding a press conference on June 28, 1943. He denounced the rumors as a deliberate, malicious lie and announced that he had ordered the FBI to investigate their origins. This presidential defense was a massive blow to the slanderers. Finally, and perhaps most effectively, Hobby took her case directly to the American people, especially to the parents. She delivered a series of national radio addresses. Her calm, measured Texas drawl a powerful antidote to the hysterical rumors. In one famous speech, she spoke not as a military director, but as a fellow parent. The uniform a WAAC wears is a symbol of honorable service. When you hear these vicious, unsubstantiated rumors against them, remember that they are slandering your own daughters. She organized Parents' Days at WAAC training centers, allowing families to see the discipline and purpose of the Corps for themselves. It was a slow, arduous battle, but Hobby's truth campaign worked. By the fall of 1943, the tide had turned. The slander had been exposed as the lie it was, and public confidence in the WAAC began to recover. Hobby had saved her Corps by refusing to hide, fighting for its honor in the open, and trusting in the fundamental decency of the American people. The Achilles heel of auxiliary status. While Hobby fought the public relations war, a different kind of battle was brewing within the War Department. The very compromise that had allowed the WAAC to be born, its auxiliary status, was now proving to be its greatest liability. As WWICs were deployed in greater numbers and into more complex roles, the logistical and legal absurdities of serving with the Army but not in it became an administrative nightmare. The problems, detailed in stacks of memos between Hobby's office and the Judge Advocate General, were legion. Pay and rank. WWICs were paid less than their male counterparts of equivalent rank. A male private first class earned more than a female auxiliary first class doing the exact same job. This disparity was a constant source of poor morale. Benefits and protections. This was the most critical flaw. As auxiliaries, WWICs were not entitled to the full range of veterans' benefits. If they were injured in the line of duty, their medical care was limited. If they were killed, their families received a pittance from a civilian insurance policy, not the standard military death gratuity, and they were not entitled to a flag-draped coffin or a military funeral. Overseas deployment. The biggest crisis loomed with the planned deployment of WWII to the European and Pacific theaters. As civilians under contract, if a WAAC were captured by the Germans or Japanese, she would not be protected by the Geneva Conventions as a prisoner of war. She would be considered a spy or an illegal partisan, subject to immediate execution. General Eisenhower, preparing for the invasion of North Africa, sent a blunt cable to the War Department in early 1943. He stated that he desperately needed the skills of WAAC telephone operators and cryptographers for his headquarters, but he could not, in good conscience, bring them into a war zone without the full legal protections of military status. The auxiliary model was unsustainable. It was inefficient, inequitable, and, as the war escalated, dangerously irresponsible. Hobby, who had foreseen these problems from the very beginning, now had a mountain of evidence to prove her case. The WAAC had proven its value beyond all doubt. Now, it was time for the Army to fully embrace it. The final battle for legitimacy was about to be fought, once again, in the halls of Congress. From auxiliary to Army, the birth of the WAC. By the spring of 1943, the case for militarizing the WAAC was overwhelming. Director Hobby, armed with testimonials from top generals and a grim ledger of administrative problems, worked with the War Department to draft a new piece of legislation. This bill would abolish the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps and create, in its place, the Women's Army Corps, WAC, an integral part of the Army of the United States. This time, the congressional debate was entirely different. The slander campaign had, ironically, worked in the Corps' favor by forcing its powerful defenders, from the president down, to publicly and forcefully state its importance. The derisive jokes and sexist condescension of 1941 were gone, replaced by sober discussions of military necessity. Congresswoman Edith Norse Rogers, who had started the fight 2 years earlier, once again led the charge, but this time she was not a lone crusader. She was backed by a chorus of the nation's most respected military leaders. General Marshall's testimony was decisive. He told the House Military Affairs Committee that the auxiliary arrangement has proven unsatisfactory and that full military status was essential for the conduct of the war. The most powerful endorsement came from overseas. General Dwight D. Eisenhower sent a cable from his headquarters in Algiers, which was read into the congressional record. "I am enthusiastic for the value of the WACs," he stated, noting their efficiency, zeal, and esprit, and concluding, "I have recommended that their strength be doubled in this theater." Against such testimony, the opposition crumbled. On July 1, 1943, President Roosevelt signed Public Law 78-110. The WAAC was no more. In its place stood the WAC. The transition was immediate. On July 5, 1943, in a small ceremony in General Marshall's office, Oveta Culp Hobby raised her right hand and was sworn in again, this time not as a director of a civilian auxiliary, but as a full colonel in the Army of the United States. She was the first woman to ever hold the title. All WACs were given a choice: either join the new WAC, with all the rights and responsibilities of a soldier, or be honorably discharged. In a resounding vote of confidence in Hobby's leadership in the Corps' mission, nearly 75% of the women chose to take the oath and become the first female soldiers in the history of the U.S. Army. The compromise was over. The experiment was a success. The women had won their place not alongside, but inside the ranks. Now, as full-fledged soldiers, they would be deployed to every corner of the globe, playing a role in the final victory that no one, not even General Marshall, could have fully imagined just 2 years prior. Eisenhower's own, the WACs in the European theater. The first major overseas test for the newly minted Women's Army Corps came in the European Theater of Operations, ETO. General Eisenhower, who had been one of the most forceful advocates for full military status, was preparing for the largest amphibious invasion in history, Operation Overlord, the D-Day landings in Normandy. His supreme headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, was a sprawling, multinational nerve center that processed a staggering volume of intelligence, plans, and communications. He needed the absolute best personnel, and he had specifically requested WACs. The first contingent of 5 WAC companies arrived in London in July 1943, shortly after the Corps' conversion. Their arrival marked a new chapter. Unlike the British ATS, who were forbidden from serving outside the UK, the WACs were a deployable force. These women were not typists plucked from a secretarial pool, they were specialists. Many were expert telephone and switchboard operators, tasked with managing the transatlantic communications that were the lifeblood of the Allied command. Archival SHAEF telephone logs reveal the immense pressure of their work. They were connecting Churchill to Roosevelt, Marshall to Eisenhower, often with buzz bombs falling on London around them. Their speed and accuracy in handling coded, top-secret traffic were critical. Another elite group consisted of cryptographers and cartographers. Working in secure bunkers, they helped decode intercepted German messages and plot enemy troop movements on the massive wall maps that guided Allied strategy. The secrecy of their work was absolute. They knew details of the coming invasion that even high-ranking field commanders were not privy to. The presence of the WACs transformed the operational tempo of SHAEF. Their efficiency in administrative roles freed up thousands of men for combat-related duties. Eisenhower became so reliant on their competence that his WAC contingent was often referred to as Eisenhower's own. When SHAEF moved from London to the continent after the Normandy landings, the WACs went with it, setting up communications and headquarters first in makeshift facilities in Normandy, and later in Versailles and Frankfurt. A particularly telling piece of archival footage shows WACs operating a mobile switchboard out of the back of a truck just miles behind the front lines in France. They endured the same field conditions as the men, care rations, mud, and the constant threat of air raids. Their service in the ETO was the ultimate vindication of Hobby's vision. They were not just auxiliaries, they were integral components of the command structure that orchestrated the defeat of Nazi Germany. They had proven that women could not only serve in a war zone but could be indispensable to its successful prosecution. The Pacific frontier, service in a different kind of war. While the WACs in Europe operated in the heart of Allied High Command, those deployed to the Southwest Pacific Area, SWPA, under General Douglas MacArthur faced a profoundly different set of challenges. The war against Japan was fought across vast oceanic distances and a punishing tropical climate rife with disease. In May 1944, the first contingent of over 5,500 WACs began arriving in the theater, with initial deployments to Sydney, Australia, and later to forward bases in Oro Bay, New Guinea, and Manila in the Philippines. MacArthur, initially one of the most vocal skeptics of using women, had been converted by the dire manpower shortages in his command. He needed clerks, mail sorters, photographers, and draftsmen to run his sprawling headquarters, and WACs were the only available solution. Life for the WACs in the SWPA was a constant battle against the environment. They lived in primitive conditions, often in hastily constructed wooden barracks or even tents, surrounded by dense, malarial jungle. Heat, humidity, and an endless plague of insects were their constant companions. Medical records from the theater show high rates of jungle rot, a type of skin fungus, dysentery, and other tropical ailments among the women. Yet, their work was vital. WAC photographic technicians developed the reconnaissance photos that revealed Japanese positions. WAC draftsmen created the detailed maps used by invasion forces. One of the most critical roles was in postal service. At a time when mail was the only link to home and a primary driver of morale, WACs took over the chaotic postal directories, sorting and redirecting millions of letters to soldiers scattered across countless remote islands. Perhaps their most significant contribution was as cryptographers and communications specialists. In MacArthur's headquarters in Brisbane and later in Manila, WACs worked in top-secret signal intelligence units, operating the complex machinery that decrypted Japanese military and diplomatic codes. Their work provided MacArthur with invaluable intelligence on Japanese ship movements and troop dispositions, directly influencing his island-hopping strategy. The women who served in the Pacific demonstrated a different kind of fortitude. They were not under direct enemy fire as often as the men, but they faced the daily grind of a debilitating climate and extreme isolation, all while performing high-pressure technical jobs. Their resilience and professionalism under such adverse conditions won over even the most hardened skeptics in MacArthur's command, proving the WWII was not just a European phenomenon but a globally effective force. The unsung heroes, the 6,888th. Of all the WWII units to serve overseas, none faced a more unique challenge or overcame more prejudice than the 6,888th Central Postal Directory Battalion. Authorized in late 1944, the 6,888th was the only all-black, all-female battalion to serve overseas during World War II. At the time, the U.S. Army was still rigidly segregated. African American soldiers, and WACs, were typically assigned to menial labor roles and faced constant discrimination. The mission of the 6,888th was born of a crisis of morale. By early 1945, the mail system for the millions of American personnel in Europe had completely broken down. Warehouses in Birmingham, England, and later Rouen, France, were filled to the rafters with a backlog of undelivered mail and packages, an estimated 17 million items. Soldiers at the front had gone months without a word from home, and the effect on morale was catastrophic. Enter the 6,888th, commanded by Major, later Lieutenant Colonel, Charity Adams Early, a brilliant and determined officer. The battalion of over 850 women arrived in Birmingham in February 1945. They were confronted by cavernous, unheated aircraft hangars stacked with mountains of mail, infested with rats. The tracking system was non-existent. Parcels and letters were often addressed simply to Junior, U.S. Army, or with a common name like Robert Smith, of which there were thousands in the ETO. The Army gave them 6 months to clear the backlog. Major Adams, assessing the situation, vowed to do it in 3. Working in 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, the women of the 6,888th attacked the problem with military precision. They devised their own ingenious locator systems, using service numbers and unit rosters to track down the intended recipients. Their motto became "No mail, low morale." They dealt not only with the monumental task but also with the dual prejudices of being women and being black. They were housed in segregated, often inferior, quarters and were often snubbed by white American soldiers. Yet, they persevered. In just 3 months, they cleared the entire Birmingham backlog. They then moved to Rouen, France, and did the same there. In total, they processed an average of 65,000 pieces of mail per shift, reconnecting millions of soldiers with their families. The 6,888th was not just a postal battalion, it was a symbol of defiance and excellence, a unit that succeeded spectacularly in a critical mission while overcoming the systemic racism of the very army they served. Their story remains one of the most inspiring, and until recently, little-known sagas of the war. The cost and the legacy. By VJ Day in August 1945, the Women's Army Corps had proven itself an unqualified success. More than 150,000 women had served, with over 17,000 deployed overseas to every major theater of war. They filled an astonishing 239 different job categories, from mechanics and parachute riggers to intelligence analysts and air traffic controllers. Army studies concluded they had freed up a division of men for combat, just as General Marshall had hoped. The WACs had not only met expectations, they had exceeded them in nearly every measurable way. But this success came at a cost. The women of the WAC faced dangers both seen and unseen. While the law prohibited them from serving in combat, this line became increasingly blurred. WACs in London endured V-1 and V-2 rocket attacks. WACs in a hospital unit were on the beach during the Anzio landings. On April 28, 1945, a kamikaze struck the hospital ship USS Comfort off Okinawa, killing 6 WACs along with Army nurses and medical personnel. In total, 16 WACs were killed by direct enemy action, and 657 received medals and citations for their service, including the Legion of Merit, the Bronze Star, and the Purple Heart. Oveta Culp Hobby, who had built the Corps from nothing, stepped down as director in July 1945, her mission accomplished. For her historic service, she was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal, the first woman in Army history to receive it. In his citation, General Marshall wrote that she had skillfully and successfully guided the Women's Army Corps through its formative period to its present state of efficiency. The legacy of the WAC and Hobby's leadership is profound and multifaceted. It directly led to the permanent integration of women into the U.S. Armed Forces with the passage of the Women's Armed Services Integration Act of 1948. It shattered countless stereotypes about the capabilities of women, paving the way for future generations to enter professions once considered exclusively male. The WACs who returned to civilian life did so with new skills, confidence, and a sense of their own potential, contributing to the post-war economic boom and the burgeoning women's rights movement. They were, in the truest sense of the word, pioneers. The Colonel returns home. In the summer of 1945, Colonel Oveta Culp Hobby returned to her home in Houston, Texas. She quietly resumed her life as a wife, mother, and newspaper executive, leaving the military spotlight as gracefully as she had entered it. To the end of her life, she rarely spoke of her wartime service, deflecting praise and insisting that the credit belonged to the women of the Corps. But her achievement remains one of the great administrative and social triumphs of the war. In the face of deep-seated prejudice, political opposition, and a vicious slander campaign, she had used her intelligence, poise, and unshakable determination to build a formidable military organization from scratch. She navigated the labyrinth of Army bureaucracy, won over skeptical generals, and inspired a nation's daughters to answer the call to service. The story of the WAC is not merely about women taking on men's jobs. It is a story of how a nation, in a moment of existential crisis, was forced to reconsider its own deepest prejudices. It is a story of how military necessity became a catalyst for social progress. Oveta Culp Hobby did not set out to be a social revolutionary, she was a pragmatist tasked with solving a problem. But in solving that problem with such brilliant efficiency, she irrevocably changed the landscape of the U.S. military and American society. She proved that courage is not gendered, that leadership is not defined by a uniform, and that patriotism resides in any heart willing to serve. From a single, borrowed desk in the munitions building, this colonel in a skirt had not only helped to win the war but had also opened a door through which millions of American women would eventually march. The archive is now closed.